If a guy likes playing football, then that's what he'll use to get kind of angry bits out of him, you know, that you build up through any day. Someone will toot the horn in the car behind you and you'll get angry and you'll have no release for it, you know. Well, that happens to everybody, but you know, like, I've got the advantage of being able to sort of play that out on the guitar by being sort of fairly aggressive in the way I play.
Here we have British blues legend Eric Clapton discussing the process of playing out emotions on guitar through improvisation. How much weight does the notion of improvisation being tied to a musician's emotions actually hold? When you hear a musician use their muscle memory and regurgitate the product of countless hours of practicing their favourite licks, we hear a composite of their influences all muddled together and baked into a brand new expression. But what really happens in a musician's brain whilst they're improvising? There's still so much that we don't understand about the brain, but certain events and studies can give us useful insights. The jazz guitarist Pat Martino, after huge success in the 1960s and 70s, was left completely unable to play the instrument after brain surgery in 1980. Martino lost all knowledge of his career or the ability to play guitar. Incredibly, he relearned the instrument totally from scratch. Just 7 years after this, he released the live album The Return. Musicians were aware of this story, and some of those who needed to undergo brain surgery wanted a way to avoid this. There are incredible stories of musicians undergoing live brain surgery whilst playing their instruments, in an attempt to give the surgeons an indication of, hey, don't touch this part, I need this part to shred. At King's College Hospital, London in 2020, Dagmar Turner played the violin during her surgery, so her hand movements and coordination could be observed and undamaged during the millimeter-precise procedure. Similarly, in Durban, South Africa, the jazz bassist Musa Manzini was awake during a 6-hour operation so that he could improvise during the surgery. Dr. Enneke, a neurosurgeon leading the operation, said, quote, "In this way we can test the regions of the brain before the tumour is removed." The surgery was successful, which implies Dr. Enneke is one cool cat that was able to distinguish jazz guitar from random non-sequential notes because they accidentally chopped off too much of his brain. In this video, I want to explore a brief history of improvisation, as well as the thoughts of prolific musicians on the subject, and thanks to some amazing studies of musicians improvising inside of MRI scanners, what actually happens to our brains whilst improvising. This is a new venture on YouTube and essentially just an excuse to spend hours researching stuff I find interesting to do with music at my computer. So please let me know if you enjoy the video below by clicking the like button and subscribe button. In Western music as far back as the 9th century, we have records of people studying, trigger warning for music students here, counterpoint. Part of this musical education required the student to be able to improvise counterpoint over a cantus firmus. This is quite the contrast to later developments we'd see in Western classical music, with very strict rigid notation dictating every note, every rhythm, in order to allow ever-growing ensembles to perform together. We do see improvisational elements later in Western classical music, such as in Bach's 5th Brandenburg Concerto, where the harpsichord solo breaks the concerto form. Despite this being written down in notation, it's thought that the composition of this section was improvised by Bach. The rest of the ensemble stopped to allow the harpsichord to flourish. As a side note, the guitar solo by Jimmy Page in Led Zeppelin's Heartbreaker harkens back to this style.
There's Jimmy Page, one of the greatest thieves of American black music who ever walked the earth.
Black music and Bach music, it seems, Homer. Bach was also known for his ability to improvise fugues, a contrapuntally complex musical style where an initial melody subject repeats and harmonizes over itself, often seen to composers as a sort of musical Sudoku to figure out. Bach's ability to improvise these is incredibly impressive. Towards the end of his life, he came up with a fugue that King Frederick of Prussia gave him, supposedly because of its insolvable difficulties. The raga, found in Indian music with records going back to around 1000 BCE, simply provided a melodic framework within which the musician would improvise. Improvisation here wasn't attributed to an invention of the performer, but rather that they were discovering the notes which represented a manifestation of divine gods and goddesses. The improvisational element is considered to have the ability to control the emotions of audiences. Likewise, despite huge variation and diversity in its nature due to the vastness of the continent, one common thread across African music was improvisation. Usually a framework is provided in the form of a static rhythm which performers then improvise other rhythms over, often in a call and response style. This tradition was carried on into work songs performed by men and women stolen for the abhorrent use of slavery. Thought to have originated in roughly the 1890s, the music isn't all that well documented, likely due to racial discrimination in the US at the time. But some of the earliest blues tracks recorded, such as Memphis Blues by W.C. Handy in 1912, show us a combination of gospel music crossed with western hymns, folk and country music, western harmony, and the elements of African improvisation under the call and response form. This mixed together to create a genre of music which would be orally evolved by musicians such as Bessie Smith, and then on to Son House, Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton to continue this musical trend, with the instrumentation eventually becoming electrified in Chicago blues with guys like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and John Lee Hooker. Audiences in America at the time took a liking to the blues and jazz music they heard on the radio, and musicians such as Elvis, Bill Haley, and Jerry Lee Lewis put their own spin on it, including these sections of improvisation on instruments such as the piano, guitar, bass, and drums. This then travelled over the Atlantic and became the British blues explosion, where artists such as the Rolling Stones discovered and incorporated blues elements into their music. With these steps, improvisation had found its way into all elements of popular music and massively changed the trajectory of Western musical composition. Now that we understand a bit more about the history of improvisation, let's take a look at what actually happens in a musician's brain whilst they're improvising. A study published in 2008 can help us here. It showed the brain activity of jazz musicians who were improvising whilst inside an MRI scanner. A special keyboard was created out of non-magnetic materials, as usually MRI imaging is crazy strong and you can't take anything into the room with you without it flying out your pockets.
Magnets! Oh!
The musicians then had to perform whilst lying down inside an MRI scanner. Two really interesting results were found from the MRI scans. Firstly, the medial prefrontal cortex showed increased activity, which makes sense as it's the area of the brain used in decision making and memory retrieval. During improvisation, there of course has to be some decisive element of which licks to play, what key you're in, dynamics to play at, when a solo starts to become purely self-indulgent, and the memory retrieval process needs to be active to pull on your mental library of licks and theoretical concepts in order to know what you're playing. Researchers have stated that increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex encourages idea generation and self-expression, which also makes sense in the context of improvisation. Conversely, the study also found that there was actually a decrease in the lateral prefrontal cortex. This region is responsible for the inhibition of urges and monitoring and correcting your behavior. That's right, in one of the most rock and roll scientific discoveries ever, we learned that whilst improvising, musicians' brains decrease the correcting of their social behavior. Practically, this is useful for many reasons. The nature of improvisation places such importance on decision in the moment that a musician can't second-guess themselves or overthink what they're about to play. In a similar study, the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders conducted a study on spontaneous lyrical improvisation, with 12 rappers freestyling inside of MRI scanners. There is a direct correlation in the results, with the medial prefrontal cortex showing increased activity and the lateral prefrontal cortex showing decreased activity. But we also see in the comparisons of rappers performing memorized pieces instead of improvised ones that there's an overall increase in brain activity when being creative and improvising. When a rapper was freestyling instead of performing a memorized piece, scans show increased activity in the areas of the brain involved in visualization, as well as cerebellum activity, which plays an important role in motor control. The cerebellum doesn't initiate movement, but it does contribute to coordination, precision, and accurate timing. Creativity generally requires a disassociation from yourself and any preconceived notions around what you're trying to do. With your decision making and idea generation enhanced, and your idea of how you would usually behave being numbed, there's a balance which allows for improvisation whilst disassociating. It's also interesting that these same patterns which have shown up here also appear during REM sleep. It makes sense as dreams are often disassociative and allow for creativity without your usual preconceptions of yourself and the world clouding them. Also, it's quite nice to think of an improvising musician's brain being similar to the brain of someone dreaming. This also would perhaps explain why many musicians would describe the feeling of improvisation as being in flow state. Flow is a state of consciousness that can be achieved when your skill level as a task perfectly meets the difficulty of what you're trying to do. It results in a feeling of timelessness, and you will have felt it any time you've been stuck in one activity for ages and you're so locked into it that you lose track of time. If you try a task too difficult for your skill level, it causes anxiety. If you try a task too easy for your skill level, it causes boredom. But right in the middle is that perfect state of flow. It provides similar advantages to those received from meditation. The results from the MRI improvisation experiment seem to back up that an improvising musician is likely to be in a state of flow. Flow state can occur in all sorts of activities, from cooking, exercising, even showering, and the increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex during flow would explain the phenomenon of shower thoughts. Thomas Edison understood this and even kept a pipe organ in his laboratory to help him enter flow state and achieve increased idea generation. Jacob Collier, the musician's musician and all-round freaky-deaky Sonic the Hedgehog-giving genius prodigy, discusses the idea that the performer's brain and inner ear is often ahead of their hands and what they're able to replicate physically.
My ear is up here and my technique is down here. How can I get them to be married without one getting smaller?
The idea that we can hear what we play before we play it is indicative of the medial prefrontal cortex being active with its decision-making, whilst our lateral prefrontal cortex subsides to remove the worry and overthinking about what we're about to play, allowing for the state of flow to proceed and turn the ideas from within our heads into being physically replicated on the instrument through muscle memory. Jacob Collier is an incredible musician for his ability to improvise. As Clapton said in the opening clip of this video, musicians are able to channel their emotions into their playing by thinking about this feeling. Jacob Collier possesses this ability through dedicated practice and careful consideration in the moment to take this a step further by invoking a vast array of contrasting emotions, as we can see here when he improvises pieces based on one emotive word. During his 2022 world tour, he also took on the ambitious challenge of performing a solo piano and vocal piece in every city he played that was relevant to the local area. He performed it each time, supposedly without having even looked at the song, going in totally blind or deaf and playing the song for the first time ever live. I was lucky enough to see an incredible version of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You at his London show, and after hours of searching on YouTube to try and relive the experience, I couldn't find any and had to rely on my terrible millennial ADHD memory. A few months later, he announced the release of an album featuring some of his favourite recordings of these improvisations, so I was beyond chuffed when I saw it featured that recording from London. The album is well worth a listen if you want to hear a masterclass of improvisation. Collier is famous for his incredibly high levels of musicianship and a thorough understanding of all musical elements. He's able to go into scenarios like this and improvise completely from scratch because of this. But he's not totally unprepared. His knowledge of harmonic structure and relations allows him to be able to make decisions about what he's about to play whilst improvising. And this brings up the point that all improvising musicians have levels of preparation beforehand and able to be able to play with the rules they currently know. Here we have the incredible improviser Frank Zappa, who I'm told I look similar to, but personally I don't see it, discussing this idea.
My theory is this: I have a basic mechanical knowledge of the operation of the instrument, and I got an imagination. And when the time comes up in the song to play a solo, it's me against the laws of nature. I don't know what I'm going to play, I don't know what I'm going to do. I know roughly how long I have to do it, and it's a game where you have a piece of time and you get to decorate it. And depending on how intuitive the rhythm section is, it's backing you up. You can do things that are literally impossible to imagine.
Whilst Jacob Collier is very much at the top end of this ability, it's more commonly seen in a simpler form with individual solos. This could be through learning stock licks or full solos then broken down into licks, or even just practicing scales. To use Clapton as an example again, here he is discussing how certain guitar licks he learned are used in his soloing.
All these runs, you know, are put together from old phrases that I first started on, like... And now they're just all kind of messed up with other things which I learned like that, you know, which is...
The embellishment of these original blues licks from the American greats into the beautiful chaos of what British bands like Cream were able to achieve in the 60s was the basis for a lot of guitar-oriented music that followed in the latter half of the 20th century. A beautiful example of musicians from this era beginning to experiment with improvisation can be seen in the guitar playing of Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix took improvisation to another level, not just musically, but in the iconoclasm demonstrated when he famously and ritualistically set his guitar on fire at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. The story goes that there was a rivalry between Jimi Hendrix and The Who, with both competing at the festival for their entry into the American markets. Hendrix needed to outshine the showmanship and spectacle of Pete Townsend from The Who, smashing his guitar up on stage at the end of their set. Hendrix was up next, and this led him to transcending the idea of improvisation on his instrument to outshine Townsend, and he ended up setting his own guitar ablaze. Hendrix was quoted as saying, "I decided to destroy my guitar at the end of a song as a sacrifice. You sacrifice things you love. I love my guitar." But for me, Hendrix's best example of transcending improvisation past the basic principles of music theory was his performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock in 1969. In one of the most iconic moments in rock and roll history, Hendrix politicized his performance with a critique of the Vietnam War, of which he had been made to fight in. The Star-Spangled Banner was originally a composed, disjunct melody with huge leaps between the notes attempting to express the grandeur of the United States. Hendrix parodied this by playing a chaotic version whilst using his guitar to create sound effects mimicking bombs dropping. This is musical improvisation and political critique at its finest. Steve Lacy, the saxophonist improviser, said that the difference between composition and improvisation is that in composition you have all the time you want to decide what to say in 15 seconds, whilst in improvisation you have 15 seconds. The addition of this hugely expressional element of freedom in music helped connect audiences to performers and vice versa by allowing for a psychological communication that even non-musicians understand. Improvisation in music is an extension of an experience we encounter in our daily lives, reacting to the constant deliberations that occur throughout any given day. Our lives, like many of the songs musicians might improvise over, are structured to an extent, with realms of chaos and unknown that we have to contend with and react to. Watching a musician improvise in the middle of an otherwise structured and expected song provides a cathartic break from an otherwise predictable format. Uncertainties in our daily lives aren't a negative thing. They provide excitement and help keep us engaged, the same as a great improvisation does. Musicians are trained to reduce uncertainties, practicing the same pieces or licks over and over, expecting a band member to come in or stop at a certain part, but an improvised section is a great way to break this and connect ideas together in a creative space. Playing with expectation is a key part of engaging audiences in performances and songwriting, and a section dedicated to pushing this boundary with organized chaos is a tool that revolutionized Western music in the 20th century. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any thoughts on improvisation in music, or just any topics you want me to chat about in future videos. And please subscribe if you want to see more discussions on musical topics like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.